Hello, welcome back to Smart Business Evolution, also known as SBE. My name is Michael Crane, and on behalf of the entire team, thank you for joining us. As you know, we put these very short training segments together to share general business intelligence and life wisdom, if you will, to help you and I reach further towards our full potential. Now, they're only about 3 to 5 minutes in duration, so let's go ahead and jump into today's session, and that is dread. Now, when I say dread, I'm talking about that feeling that gnarls up and begins to roll around in our gut, and we just wish it would go away, especially the dread that we feel right before we engage in a difficult conversation. Now, you and I know difficult conversations can happen anywhere. They can happen at home, they can happen with our colleagues, and they can even take place with our clients. So how do we most effectively deal with difficult conversations? Well, fortunately for you and I met David Morris of Chesapeake Energy, and he shared with me that there are 3 stories to keep in mind before we engage in a difficult conversation. And if we keep these 3 stories in mind, we'll have less difficult conversation. So what are those stories? Well, number 1, it's our story. Number 2, it's the stories that we tell ourselves. And number 3 is the whole story. So let's go ahead and start off with the first one, our story. Our story refers to how we were taught and how we were trained to deal with difficult conversations in our past. You know, there are many different styles of families, but we can find some commonalities as to how families deal with difficult conversations. For some families, we dig a hole as deep as we can get it, and then we just stuff it. We just pretend it doesn't even exist. Other families, well, we deal with it by camouflage. And what I mean by that is we get passive aggressive. We withhold information, or we withhold feelings, or we become conveniently unavailable, right? Or we begin to talk about family members behind their back. And of course, we see that in office politics all the time. Other families, well, what we do is we roll up our verbal sleeves, right? And we just get in there and we just spew at one another, often making the situation a whole lot worse. Now, why is it important for you and I to understand our story? Because how we were taught to deal with problems in the past is often how we want to default and treat it in the present. How we embrace difficult conversations and difficult people of our past is typically our natural default in the present. So it's important for us to reflect back and think through, how was I taught to deal with difficult conversation, and is that the most productive? And if not, then we need to choose a different course of action. So our story is important. Number 2 is the stories that we tell ourselves. It's the voices that we listen to inside of our head. It's the assumptions that we make about why another person is saying or doing something. And of course, a lot of times we embrace and engage in a difficult conversation from a foundation of untruth. Case in point. Recently, I was going from LA to Atlanta. When I got to my plane and got to my row, I looked over and there's a gentleman already in my seat. And he's almost already asleep. He's on my window, right? Now, inside my head, I began to listen to this voice and thought, how inconsiderate, how arrogant of this guy, and I need to have a difficult conversation with him. Now, fortunately for me, about right then, I realized it was either sit at the window or sit in the aisle. It wasn't about Michael in the middle, so I calmed myself down long enough to open up my laptop, put in my headphones, and I began to work. Now, the whole time I'm trying to forget what he's done to me, right? But the voices in my head continue to get louder and louder, and the assumptions continue to get stronger and stronger. Now, it's a long flight, so I got up twice to go to the restroom, and upon my second return, I get to my seat, and he's awake, and he looks at me and says this. He says, well, I'm glad I took your seat. And he could see on my face that I was perplexed and even a little bit angry. And he said, please allow me to explain. I got onto the flight first because I'm in a wheelchair. And when I realized that they put me in the aisle, I knew that would be a mistake because it's a long flight and I had a feeling you would need to get up. And unfortunately, I cannot. And so you would have had to climb all over me to get to the restroom. And I'm a big guy and that would make you and I feel uncomfortable. So with you in mind, I moved over. I hope you don't mind. And of course, at that time I said, oh, well, of course not. No big deal. Wow, can you imagine if I had listened to the voices in my head and jumped to conclusion, right? And acted upon those voices. What a mistake that would have been. So it's important for us to quiet those voices down and not make assumptions, which leads me to the third point, and that is the whole story. And that is where we unpack and we open up and we look for all the variables, all the facts of the matter before we engage in a difficult conversation or before we make a statement we're going to regret. Now, I know difficult conversations can sometimes be spontaneous, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep top of mind that I need to find out what it is I don't know. Ask good questions before we make a statement that you and I are going to regret. See, if we keep these three stories in mind, I have no doubt you and I will have less difficult conversations. Thank you, David Morris.